All right. Good afternoon, board members, board staff, and anyone else and everyone else on the call today. Um, my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a senior environmental scientist working for California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the northern region. Been working on Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creeks since 2003 as a field biologist. Beginning in 2012, I started advancing in my career, working on more and more complex work in the watersheds, including fish passage projects, lake stream bed alteration agreements, and emergency regulations with the State Water Board. Going to present on a few topics today, starting with status of fish species in Mill and Deer Creeks, our flow studies, flow recommendations. So I'll go ahead and begin. Please advance to the next slide. Just starting with some basic background on fish species in Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creeks, starting with Springer and Chinook. State and federally listed as a threatened fish species, listed in 1999, and that was reaffirmed in 2005. Critical habitat for Central Valley Springer and Chinook is designated in 2000 and 2005. Historically, there were 18 independent populations in the Central Valley. Today, there are only 3 extant independent populations remaining, and those happen to be on Deer Mill and Butte Creeks. Antelope Creek hosts what we consider to be a dependent population, and meaning of that word is the population would likely not persist independently currently without supplementation from neighboring independent populations, such as those from Mill and Deer Creeks. However, Antelope Creek would likely support an independent spring run population if fish had suitable flow conditions below Edwards Dam and all water year types, and likely did support an independent population prior to settlement and development of Antelope's water. Regardless of independent versus dependent population status, Antelope Creek provides historic spring run holding and spawning habitat, not blocked by an impassable rim dam. Next slide. Another important fish species, Central Valley steelhead. Species is federally listed as threatened in 1998, and that was reaffirmed in 2006. Critical habitat designated in 2000 and 2005. Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creek steelhead populations are considered Core 1, meaning they're an independent stronghold of natural origin Central Valley steelhead. Core 1 populations are critical to the health and status of their evolutionary significant unit and its persistence through time. CDFW's Northern Region and the program I now supervise monitors adult steelhead on 7 major spawning tributaries in the upper Sacramento River Basin. While Battle Creek is supported by a hatchery population of Central Valley steelhead, only Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creeks do we see a detectable and consistent presence of natural origin steelhead. And that's based on our monitoring of returning adults annually and juveniles expressing seaward outmigration through our acoustic tagging studies. Next slide. Mill, Deer, and Antelope support more than just Central Valley spring run and steelhead. In addition, there are several California species of special concern and just important species in general, starting with fall and late fall run Chinook salmon. These species support important inland and marine recreational and commercial fisheries. Hardhead are a native California species and species of special concern. Mill deer and antelope creeks provide important spawning and rearing habitat for hardhead. And finally, Pacific lamprey. They support important ecosystems as services, prey base, and marine-derived nutrients in freshwater. They're an anadromous fish species. And historically, Pacific lamprey were a lot more abundant, but still present on mill deer and antelope. Next slide. So Springer and Chinook, long been focal species for antelope, mill and deer creeks. Lots of attention, recovery actions. Just want to kind of linger here to consider their viability and how we assess that. The National Marine Fisheries Service evaluates viable salmon population metrics when evaluating the status of an ESU, including census population criteria. NMFS believes a census population of 2,500 returning adults or an average annual escapement of 834 adults is one metric needed for a salmon population to have a low risk of extinction. Mill and Deer Creek, Springer, and Chinook salmon populations have fallen short of these metrics for several generations in a row now. Springer populations in Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creeks have been in steep decline since 2015, including cohort failure of the 2023 and 2024 populations. Next slide. So we got some spring run population monitoring numbers here for mill deer and antelope. Kind of broken this down into 10-year blocks, starting with 2000 through 2009. A Mill Creek, during that 10-year period, the average population estimate was 936. On deer, the average was 1,369. And on antelope, the average was 33. Moving into the next block, 2010 to 19, the average population on mill was 383, 437 on deer, and 6 on antelope. 2022, we saw 250 Springer return to mill, 127 to deer, and 1 to antelope. 2022 kind of was the start of the return of what we call the drought cohorts from that drought that started in 2020 and lasted through 22. In 2023, we saw 34 Springer return to mill, 23 to deer, and 0 to antelope. And in 2024, although we are still evaluating our monitoring data, we have 13 Springer returning to Mill Creek, 33 to deer, and 0 to antelope. And I just want to talk about cohort collapse a little more. Kind of a definition the fish agencies have used in the last couple of years. And it really equates to a year class failure of the returning adult population, meaning not enough adults will have returned to the creeks in a given year to produce the minimum number of juveniles needed to sustain the 3-year life cycle for the generation. Obviously, this means increased risk of extinction of the species. CDFW, NMFS, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service initiated some emergency actions to mitigate this cohort collapse beginning in 23, including establishing a captive brood population at UC Davis and trapping, holding, and spawning adult spring wren captured at Keswick Dam as part of Livingston Stone's winter run brood stock collection. The captive brood population facility is located at the University of California, Davis's Center for Aquatic Biology and Aquaculture, or CABA. CABA facility has a long history of supporting California endemic fish species in captivity, including winter and Chinook salmon. The captive brood population is comprised of juvenile spring run trapped in Deer, Mill, and Butte Creeks from the 2022 through 2024 spawning cohorts. Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery annually traps adult spring run at Keswick Dam as bycatch during their adult winter and Chinook broodfish collection efforts. Normally, these captured spring run, after being genetically identified as spring run, are returned to the Sacramento River downstream of Keswick to spawn. The Livingston Stone emergency effort intends to exert more control and certainty over the spawning success of trapped adult spring run so that their offspring can be outplanted in Corwin streams, used to support the captive brood population effort, or a combination of both. Next slide. Similar slide as the previous, this one focused on Central Valley steelhead. Steelhead returned to the creeks over the winter months, kind of a hard critter to monitor, but we've made great gains in our ability to monitor spring run in the last 10 to 15 years using video camera and sonar monitoring stations. So I have less trend data to show you here, but we have data for all three creeks back to 2014. And on Mill Creek, the years 14, 15 through 21, 22 covers the whole water year. We saw an average of 238 fish, steelhead returning to Mill, 177 returning to Deer, and 78 returning to Antelope. In 23, we saw 76 steelhead return to Mill, 6 steelhead return to Deer, 76 return to Antelope. 2024, we just have the winter-spring period, data collection finalized. Fall 2024 monitoring and data acquisition is underway. Last winter and spring, we saw 14 steelhead return to Mill, 5 to Deer, and 25 to Antelope. Just for some context, we do have historic steelhead data from Mill Creek, a former diversion dam known as Cliff Dam on the valley floor had a counting station that was operated by the department 1953 through 1963. That time, Mill Creek steelhead population estimates range from 417 to 2,269 fish, with an average of 1,160 fish over that period. Historic steelhead counts from Antelope and Deer Creek are not available. Next slide. This slide is kind of focusing on the threats associated with stream diversions from the creeks. Just one stressor in the freshwater landscape for these fish, but an important one. Insufficient in-stream flow resulting from water diversions and lower Mill, Deer, and Antelope creeks has been identified by CDFW and NEMS as a key stressor to spring run, Chinook, and steelhead population viability. Increased in-stream flows during all life stages are needed to prevent further decline in populations and promote species recovery. Historical water diversion and water use practices have long been out of balance with ecological needs on these three critical watersheds. The impacts of water diversions on spring run and steelhead in Mill, Deer, and Antelope creeks is amplified in the present day because of climate change and the increased periodicity of droughts. Diversions from these tributaries can impede or prevent migration of anadromous salmonids during critical passage periods, degrade water quality conditions, and disproportionately impact late migrating individuals in years where water supply is limited. In nearly all years, diversions create extreme low flow conditions during the summer that can result in disconnected stream sections and reduced ecological stream function and productivity. Next slide. Here I'm going to get into the data used in our flow studies, what CDFW did on Mill and Deer Creeks and Stillwater Sciences on Antelope Creeks. CDFW completed flow studies on Mill and Deer Creeks and Stillwater Sciences on Antelope Creek. Conditions at passage limiting sites or critical riffles were evaluated based on minimum depth and maximum velocity criteria for adult salmon and steelhead over a range of flows. The data collected were used to predict the amount of passable channel width meeting the minimum depth criteria for each species. Critical riffles are shallow, typically fast-moving sections of a stream formed by cobble deposition. Since they are naturally shallow, critical riffles are particularly sensitive to changes in stream flow. Diminishing flow and associated shallow water depth at critical riffles can impede or prevent passage of adult salmonids to and from spawning areas and inhibit juvenile salmonids from moving between rearing habitats and can reduce the channel's connectivity. Insufficient depth at critical riffles can also result in abrasion injury and stress when fish are passing through the riffle, leading to reduced fitness, greater susceptibility to infection, and increased risk of pre-spawn mortality. Next slide. Table on this slide details minimum depth criteria, 0.9 feet for adult Chinook and 0.7 feet for adult steelhead. These depths were applied to estimate the relationship between flow and the correlating feet of transect across the critical riffle meeting this depth criteria. Minimum depth criteria are based on the water depth needed for a fish to navigate over a shallow riffle with sufficient clearance underneath it to minimize contact. The maximum passage velocity of 8 feet per second was based on swimming ability of adult salmonids to pass over barriers. These criteria minimize abrasion and contact with the stream bed, maintain fish in good spawning condition, and maximize propulsion. The stream cross-section figure illustrates the section of the critical riffle where sufficient depth allows adult Chinook and steelhead to pass through the riffle without contacting the stream bed. This depth must be met along a portion of the total and contiguous riffle width to provide adequate and safe passage. Next slide. Weighted perimeter and ecological flows. In addition to evaluating passage at critical riffles, the department conducted analysis of flow conditions needed to support ecological stream function during the summer months when salmonid migrations have ceased, using the weighted perimeter method. The weighted perimeter method is a tool that can be used to analyze the low flow component of the hydrologic regime. Riffles tend to generate high concentrations of dissolved oxygen and consist of substrates that are well suited to support benthic macroinvertebrate production. Because they are shallow, riffles are more sensitive to changes in stream flow than other habitat types. The weighted perimeter method identifies a low flow ecological threshold to protect productive riffle habitats during the sensitive dry season, where aquatic species may be particularly vulnerable to reductions in flow and poor water quality. Bed elevation, water surface elevation, and discharge are collected. These thresholds are identified by evaluating the relationship between flow and weighted perimeter, which refers to the perimeter of a cross-sectional area of a stream bed measured at the crest of the riffle from weighted edge to weighted edge. In this figure, lower left-hand corner, it's represented by the black line. Next slide. Weighted perimeter curve. Figure in this slide shows the breakpoint and incipient asymptote. These represent the flow thresholds for ecosystem function during sensitive low flow periods. The curve in this figure reflects the amount of wetted stream bed habitat at various flows and includes two inflection points related to food production. The break point is found at the curve's first point of maximum curvature. Below this threshold, aquatic habitat conditions for benthic macroinvertebrates rapidly decline. Above the incipient asymptote, riffle productivity is optimized. Next slide. Here we have our flow recommendations by month, the basis and rationale for those recommendations. For the period October through December, we are looking at adult and juvenile salmonid passage, juvenile salmonid rearing, including juvenile winter run Chinook salmon, non-natal rearing, adult fall run Chinook salmon spawning, and ecological function the early part of October, late September. January through March, adult and juvenile salmonid passage, juvenile Chinook rearing, adult late fall run Chinook salmon spawning. April through June, adult and juvenile salmonid passage, and juvenile salmonid rearing. July 1 through 15th, adult and juvenile salmonid passage, juvenile salmonid rearing. Finally, July 16th through September 30th, kind of the high summer, we are looking at ecological function, including macroinvertebrate productivity and riparian stream vegetation. And I just want to call out our emphasis is really on these critical passage periods where there is conflict with water diversions. That includes the late spring and early summer, the high summer when diversions at their maximum and water supply is at its minimum, and the early fall period where the fish are waiting for these creeks to turn on. Turn on meaning cessation of stream diversions and the onset of the first fall rain events. Next slide. So the following three slides are going to present CDFW's flow criteria for Deer and Mill Creeks and Stillwater Sciences flow criteria developed by their studies on Antelope creeks. Importantly, the flow criteria presented in the following slides do not consider water users or other demands or beneficial uses of water. These flow criteria were developed using a scientific approach to identify an unimpeded passage of adult salmonids through critical riffles and ecological stream function in the summer months. So thinking about what I presented in the previous slide and applying it to this slide, we have our flow recommendations for critical passage periods for adult and juvenile salmonids, our summer minimum flow criteria developed through the wetted perimeter method, and all of this, it's a lot of numbers here and stuff on the table. This is the same flow criteria presented in our letter. And also want to point out that the department and Stillwater Sciences considered water year type and water year availability, and that is reflected in our approach to water year type, critical dry, below normal, above normal, and wet years. When water supply is available, we are looking at the maximum flow identified for passage over a critical riffle. And on the critical and dry years, we are lessening that flow criteria to meet minimum passage criteria over riffles. And for the summer ecological flow period, the targeted flow is right in the middle of the minimum and maximum flows identified for benthic macroinvertebrates, that kind of break point. In some years in the fall, there's not enough water supply to meet the flow criteria identified in the critical riffle analysis. In that case, we used CDFW kind of took an approach where acknowledging that not enough flow may not be available. So we are asking for, on Mill Creek in this case, 140 CFS or 80% of unimpaired flow. And we can go to the next slide, Deer Creek. And don't expect the audience to digest all of this information here, but just again, acknowledging we have adult passage flows, summer ecological flows, and flows based on water year type. And next slide. So the flow criteria developed by Stillwater Sciences, and importantly, Stillwater Sciences use the standard operating procedure that the department used for Mill and Deer Creeks. So they used the same methodology to develop their Salmon passage flows. Stillwater Sciences did not, in their study, develop a summer ecological flow. After Stillwater completed their study, the department went back and did a ecological flow analysis for Antelope Creek. Okay, next slide. Just want to, in this slide, kind of address what the water users have long emphasized in their way to achieve fish passage on the creeks. And that is largely revolved around the concept of trenching through critical riffles to provide fish passage at lower flow levels. This was kind of formalized in 2014, where Stanford Vina Ranch Irrigation Company, that's the lower water district on Deer Creek, presented a plan to CDFW to excavate a narrow channel in lower Deer Creek through 4 miles of critical habitat to provide fish passage down to an approximate 20 CFS base flow. In response, CDFW provided a technical memorandum addressing issues Stanford Vina's proposed channel modification presented regarding critical habitat modification and efficacy. In April 2021, CDFW met with water users to discuss a voluntary framework to improve fish passage via flow and non-flow actions on Deer and Mill Creeks. Water users again turned to channel modifications as a primary solution for fish passage without adequate in-stream flows. Improved fish passage solutions will always require an increase in in-stream flow over baseline conditions to be biologically sound. Mechanical stream channel modifications alone would incur unacceptable levels of habitat degradation, would not be durable, and would need to be repeated when critical riffles reform in new locations. Next slide. Now the 2024 park fire. I just want to spend a few minutes discussing the park fire. Park fire and its impacts are a large subject beyond the scope of this presentation, but I want to acknowledge it and present a few key points. Since the park fire was impactful to upper watersheds that were in relatively pristine condition before the park fire happened. Just the figure on the right is a pretty broad overview, Antelope Creek, the top of the figure, Mill Creek in the middle, Deer Creek at the bottom. This is a burn severity map, and you can kind of see that with, and it's the color schematic is as follows. Blue is low severity, yellow is mid-range or medium severity, and the warmer orange red color is higher burn severity. So these watersheds were impacted with some high burn severity, particularly for the upper reaches of Mill Creek in that center blue line. Significant portion, 42% of the park fires per perimeter burned at high and moderate soil burn, including within the Mill, Deer, and Antelope watersheds. Portions of critical habitat are now vulnerable to sedimentation and debris flows. It is likely there will be some impacts to in-stream habitat. However, this habitat is expected to recover, and impacts will not be irreversible. In-stream flows are needed to ensure fish can reach intact habitat now and into the future. And, the park fire has just happened. We've started the water year, kind of started off with a bang with a pretty significant atmospheric river event in late November. And it's kind of a wait and see to see what unfolds on the creeks regarding the impacts of the park fire. And the sediment loading we expect to enter the streams largely depends on the frequency, duration, and timing of ensuing rain events. While we do expect fire-related sedimentation during the next few wet seasons, recovery of the stream channels will take place once fine sediment loads move through these systems, and pool riffle run sequences are recreated through the turn of complex substrates. And lost riparian cover is expected to recover quickly. Next slide. So, drawing to the conclusion of my presentation, CDFW's desire to see improved flow conditions and impaired reaches of Deer, Mill, and Antelope Creeks follow broad acknowledgement that conditions in the upper reaches of all three tributaries provide exceptional habitat for spring chinook and steelhead, even during drought periods. These three Sacramento River tributaries are exceptional in the Central Valley in that spring chinook and steelhead still have access to historic habitat that is not blocked by rim dams. However, access to this habitat has been restricted by impaired flow conditions since agricultural development began in the valley flow reaches in the early 1900s. Existing documents highlighting the importance of these streams include the new California Salmon Strategy for a Hotter, Drier Future, the California Natural Resources Agency's Sacramento Valley Salmon Resiliency Strategy, NMFS's Central Valley Chinook Salmon and Steelhead Recovery Plan, and priority streams in the U.S. and Fish and Wildlife Service Final Restoration Plan for the Anadromous Fish Restoration Program. Next slide. In addition to impaired flow conditions in their tributaries, CDFW acknowledges there are many stressors across the freshwater landscape that need to be addressed to support recovery of Central Valley spring chinook and steelhead. However, reliable access to high-quality spawning and rearing habitat is a critical and achievable recovery link that is long overdue. CDFW remains committed to working with Mill, Deer, and Antelope Creek water users to protect fisheries resources and develop durable and long-term solutions to ensure salmonid passage and year-round ecological stream function in all water year types. And final slide, next. This is one of the 33 spring run that returned to Deer Creek in 24. That's the end of my presentation.